Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully you're joining us. We're going to go over a couple of basics about lumber, about the wood that you can use for your projects. Want to cover kind of three components, if you will. One is how the boards are cut, what sections of the tree they're coming from, if you will. The other is how they're cut, what effect it has on the grain of the boards. And then the last thing is some problems that we get with wood depending on how it's been cut. So the first thing to keep in mind is that there's three ways that they will generally cut lumber out of a tree. Those three are plane sawn, rift sawn, and quarter sawn. Now, plane sawn and rift sawn you very rarely see separated out. If you go to a store like ours or a specialty hardwood supplier, very rarely will you see specifically rift sawn lumber. And that's because you will get rift sawn out of exactly the same cut mechanism as you will plane sawn pieces. Quarter sawn you will almost always see identified specifically because they have, in order to get the most quarter sawn out of a tree, they have to cut it a very particular direction. So if you can see this piece here, this is a piece of cherry that has been plane sawn. It's very easy to tell that it's been plane sawn because you see these big, long cathedral rings running through it. They have essentially taken a tree and just sliced it top to bottom in a long straight line. You can also see it on the end, on this piece here. You can see how the grain kind of arcs on the end from one side to the other. That and the cathedrals that you're seeing here are indications that this was plane sawn. Rift sawn, what you'll end up seeing is a board that has this cathedral kind of pattern on just sort of one half of the board. And on the ends of it here, you'll actually see, instead of these wide, flat arcs, you'll see where it kind of runs at an angle from one face across to the other edge. So that is the plane sawn. For most species, the plane sawn gives some very dramatic cathedrals and tends to work really well for the wide panels in a door or something of that nature. The other piece is quarter sawn. Now this is also cherry. This is a piece of quarter sawn cherry. And you can see we have a very different effect between the two boards. We have a very different look between them. Quarter sawn is cut a very different direction out of the tree, and it creates a very different grain pattern here. Also creates a very different grain pattern on the end. You can see on here that the grain lines that you can see are running vertically. And this is the more stable cut out of a tree, but it is the most wasteful cut out of a tree. Because instead of just being able to utilize the entire log the way they can with the plane sawn, quarter sawn pieces, they actually take the whole tree and they cut it in quarters, and then they take each pie-shaped slice and cut down through it. So it can be very wasteful, which is also why quarter sawn pieces tend to be more expensive than plane sawn. The other advantage besides the grain structure is how stable it is. Quarter sawn pieces will move less in response to humidity and temperature than the plane sawn pieces. And so if you're building a door, like a cabinet door or something, and you're doing a rail and stile construction, these are going to be much more dimensionally stable. Now, some pieces have additional effects when you quarter saw them. So maple will tend to look very much like the cherry when you plane saw, but when you quarter saw, you get this very interesting speckled pattern that will start showing up in sections of the board. One of the most notable, probably one of the most dramatic quarter sawn species is quarter sawn white oak or quarter sawn red oak. Both of those species get these long rays and flecks that start running through the piece. Unfortunately, I didn't have a piece of that where I could show you. There are a few other interesting grain patterns that I wanted to kind of mention that don't really have anything to do with how the board was cut, but have to do more with how the tree grew. That is effects like these, where you can see ribbons and stuff running through here, or these blotching kind of patterns that are running in through here. You can get what's called curly or quilted grain, and these have to do with the stress that the tree was under when it was growing. They create very dramatic effects and are beautiful to look at. One thing you want to keep in mind, though, is if you take a block like this, I mean, this block is 2 inches thick, and you start cutting it down and making it thin, the stress that's built into this board could start to make a piece twist and warp in an unusual direction as you're working it. So whenever you're working with highly figured pieces, keep in mind that as it gets thinner, it's even more likely to warp. And speaking of, I've got one piece here and another piece back here to kind of talk about some of the things that can happen with wood as it starts to dry out. You know, most of these have been kiln dried, so they're basically put in like a giant oven and they're cooked out. As you go through the drying process, though, and then they are cut down, you get different stresses that are released in the board. As the board normalizes, as you get it into a stable environment, you'll start seeing that those issues crop up. So one of them that is very easy to demonstrate is like this piece here, if you can see it from kind of end to end. This piece actually is twisted down its length. And that's a function of the stress in the board as it was drying. Depending on the tools you have available to you, this board could still be usable. You could take and cut this board into sections, and as you cut it into sections, you minimize how much each section is twisted. If you need the whole piece and the twist isn't too bad, you can run it through a jointer and start to take the twist out of it that direction. Two others that are very common to have happen are cupping, which literally the whole board just kind of folds from edge to edge. It'll bend from the center out to the edges. And that cupping effect, if it's slight, you can get rid of in a jointer. If it's severe, you know, more than, say, 1/4 of an inch across the face, the only way to really get rid of it is to take the board and flip it so that the crown, if you will, of that curve is laying down, and run it through a table saw very carefully and try and split it down the middle. You don't want to take and set it so that the ends are down, because as soon as you run it through, it'll try and collapse in the center and it'll bind on your blade. So always try and run it where the crown is up. Twisting, as we saw. The one that's back here kind of shows what happens in a long piece where you've got grain going a bunch of different directions. You know, it's twisting up through here, it's twisting again up in here. When you look at this board edge on, you can see, you may be able to see where it's actually curling this direction and then curling, and then up in here it's actually trying to twist over on itself. So, you know, within a single board, it can do a lot of different things. This, as you may be able to see from the cathedral arches that are in here, this is a section of zebra wood that was plain sawn. Zebra wood, when it's quarter sawn, has a very different look to it and tends to be incredibly stable. Some species tend to react more than others when they're drying. Any of the woods that start out life living in a very humid environment, cypresses and things like that, the softer woods, will generally react more because they start out with a lot more water in them. The denser species, the rosewoods and whatnot, that all start out in that are just denser boards, will generally not move as much because they don't keep as much water trapped in them to begin with. Do we have any questions? Nope, apparently we don't have any questions for this. So hopefully this gives you a few things to think about as you're shopping around, and hope you have a great day.